From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to this week's Middle East Focus podcast. We'll be talking today about Russia's growing influence in the Middle East. The Russians dramatically stepped up their involvement in the Middle East in 2015 when they intervened militarily in the Syrian conflict to support President Assad after an absence of maybe a couple of decades at least. Since then, Moscow has become a hot destination for Middle Eastern leaders, with more heads of state from the region visiting the Russian capital than Washington this year. Our interns put together a tally, and Putin is beating Trump by 20-16 is the last count. We're here to discuss what does this all mean for the region? Is Russia a disruptor? Can Russia be a force alternatively for stability? What does it mean for the United States? Is it the result of U.S. retrenchment or some other dynamic? And how is it impacting the various sub-regions of the Middle East? With us today is a stellar group of experts from our Middle East Institute. Calling in from Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, is Robert Ford, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria. And with me here in the studio is Gerald Feierstein, a former ambassador to Yemen and former principal deputy assistant secretary of state, if I have that acronym correctly.
That is correct.
Did I get it right?
PDAS.
PDAS, they call it, yes. And Dr. Gonul Tol, who runs our Turkey program. Well, first, welcome, everybody, and thanks for being here. And thanks, Robert, for joining us from New Haven.
My pleasure.
Gonul, let me start with you. The Russian-Turkish relationship 2 years ago was almost at the point of war when Turkey shot down a Russian Air Force plane. And 2 weeks ago, President Erdogan and President Putin met in Ankara. President Putin visited, and their relationship seems to be very warm, whereas the relationship with the U.S. over this past weekend took a deep dive. What are your initial thoughts about these two dynamics?
Well, first, the tension with the U.S. is quite serious. Over the weekend, the U.S. decided to suspend the processing of visa, and Turkey-U.S. relationship has suffered serious problems in the past, but this has never come to that. So this is a new low point in Turkey-U.S. relations.
Well, President Trump met with President Erdogan in the U.S. a few weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, and said it's never been better.
Exactly, in September. And I think that's creating a false hope in Turkey because Trump keeps repeating these statements that Turkey-U.S. relationship is very strong and is personally very close to Erdogan. And Ankara thinks, well, whatever problems there are between the two countries, it's mostly because of a few bureaucrats who are Obama administration remnants that are causing these problems. And of course, this is problematic.
We'll come back to the U.S. towards the end of the podcast. Tell me a bit about the Russian-Turkish relationship. Why has it turned around so quickly and so positively from 2 years ago?
I think it's mainly because of the Turkey's frustration over the U.S. decision to work with the Syrian Kurds. I think Turkey at the moment feels isolated, cornered, and has nowhere else to turn because Erdogan was expecting that Trump would reverse the decision of the Obama administration to cooperate with the Syrian militia, and that didn't happen. So Turkey now thinks that the only option that it has is to work with Russia.
Well, what are they getting from Russia? I mean, politically as well as other things. Obviously in Syria, and maybe we'll talk a bit about that, there's an operation now beginning in Idlib. Idlib and other things, what's in it between the Russians and the Turks?
So that's one thing, and that's the most important thing. So in Syria, Turkey recently launched an intervention with the help of its allies in the Syrian opposition. And I think the main aim there is to first secure influence in the region and also limit the operations of the Syrian Kurds, especially in the Kurdish enclave around Afrin. So with this operation, Turkey is basically saying that we'll help you in Idlib, and in turn, you turn a blind eye to whatever we're doing with the Kurds. So that's what Turkey is getting mostly from Russia in Syria.
But they seem to be in disagreement over the northern Iraqi Kurdish situation, the recent referendum, and Turkey and Iran being very hard line. Russia has investments in the oil and gas sector in northern Iraq and seems to be on a different page. And just recently, President Putin, President Erdogan made conflicting statements about Iraqi Kurdish oil.
Yes, that's
Is that
true.
a serious point of disagreement between the two on
That's
the
true, and
northern
that
Iraq?
just shows you. Yes, I think Russia is pursuing a very nuanced Kurdish policy, has a different view on the Iraqi Kurds and the Syrian Kurds, and yes, they differ on that. I mean, from the get-go, Moscow was quiet on the KRG referendum, and that just shows you the limits to Turkey-Russia rapprochement. So there are converging interests, and that happened mostly because Turkey had to change its Syria policy dramatically. But on the other hand, the Turkey-Russia rapprochement has its limits, as we've seen with the
Well, let's
Russians.
segue, Robert, if I may, from New Haven. Segue, I mean, through Idlib and what's going on there, its impact on where the Syrian conflict is now. Obviously, there were Astana talks, the sixth round in mid-September in Astana, and there was agreement on 6 de-escalation zones and an emerging kind of, or it's been emerging for a while, Russian, Turkish, Iranian cooperation over Syria. Is Russia sort of consolidating its hold in Syria? What's its plan there?
Russia is most definitely consolidating its position in Syria, and its Astana process puts it at the center of efforts to secure a broader ceasefire in Syria prior to the launch of an overall peace negotiation in Syria.
And do you see that their long-term plan is seriously peace negotiations or a salami tactic of a few de-escalation zones here and there and then helping the regime over time take back the whole country or pretty much the whole country?
I think the Russians would be happy to get some kind of a broad peace agreement if the Syrian armed opposition groups would stop fighting, but I think the Russians are realistic enough to know how difficult that is. And Bashar al-Assad gets a vote in this too, Paul. And Bashar al-Assad, I think, is determined to keep attacking and taking one enclave after another, bit by bit by bit.
And do you see the Russian-Turkish cooperation, at least in northern Syria, as lasting, or are they going to be on different pages soon because of the particular Turkish attitude to the YPG and the Kurds in the north of Syria?
Part of that will depend also on the Russian ally, Bashar al-Assad. And my guess is that before this is finished, Turkey and the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad will have an agreed mutual interest in diminishing any autonomy that Syrian Kurds hope to enjoy.
Well, let me ask you, where does that leave, in a sense, I mean, the U.S. and all of this on 2 levels. One, where do you think the U.S. and the Russians in Syria agree and where do they seriously disagree? And given that the Americans have put many of their eggs in the Kurdish basket, where does that leave the Americans in Syria in the medium term?
The Russians and the Americans agree on 2 things. Number one, they agree that the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are bad and should be fought. And the second thing they agree on is that Bashar al-Assad should stay. The Americans basically have washed their hands of the broader civil war and said, we leave it up to Russia to settle as best Russia can. However, if the Americans add another objective to their strategy in Syria, that being defending Syrian Kurds, the PYD party affiliated to the Turkish PKK and its guerrilla force called the YPG, if the Americans do that, then they are lining up for probably an eventual conflict not only with Bashar al-Assad, but also with Turkey and probably Bashar al-Assad's ally, Russia.
Well, given that the biggest concern in Washington in that region increasingly seems to be, at least in the rhetoric, Iran, do you see U.S. and Russia diverging over Iran's deployment and presence in Syria in the near term?
I think the Americans want the smallest possible Iranian presence in Syria. The Russians can live with a much higher threshold of Iranian influence and Iranian presence. It bothers the Russians less. I don't see how the Americans will convince Vladimir Putin and the government in Moscow to break a lot of eggs trying to get the Iranians out of Syria. I don't see what's in it for Moscow.
Thank you, Robert. Jerry, let me turn to you. The Turkish-Russian relationship is not brand new, and certainly the Russian-Syrian, Russian-Iranian isn't either. The big maybe change in the last week was King Salman of Saudi Arabia, his first ever visit of a Saudi king to Moscow, just a few months after receiving President Trump and sort of declaring a revived Saudi GCC American alliance. Tell us a bit about your views and your assessment of the import of that trip.
Well, it's certainly significant, and I think that it reflects actually a trend that's been going on, really reaching back to when President Obama was still in office here. We've seen Mohammed bin Salman, at that time the deputy crown prince, now the crown prince, traveling. We've seen Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates traveling to Moscow, even after the election, making clear that they felt that it was important to have a relationship with Russia. Now we have the Salman visit underway, and obviously has achieved objectives that both sides might have.
What were the main items in the visit, the takeaways?
Well, I think that the foundation for the relationship and the foundation for why the Saudis would be seeking to have this relationship is really about the energy sector. And it's about the fact that the Russians were willing to come in and cooperate with OPEC, cooperate with the Saudis to take some steps to help stabilize the market, which has achieved some success. And therefore, that level of cooperation has given them some momentum. But I would also say that it's a reflection of the fact that even though the Gulf states expected some dramatic changes from Trump, they haven't really materialized yet. They haven't really become tangible changes in U.S. policy. And therefore, I think that the GCC states see some interest in hedging their bets a little.
What about the military component? There was talk of S-400s and other military equipment.
Right. And so I think, certainly a major feather in Putin's cap to have that on the table. I would put in a little cautionary note, though, to just say that every arms sale that's announced isn't necessarily an arms sale that's implemented. Mm-hmm. And if you're talking about a system as complicated as the S-400, trying to put that into a largely U.S. and certainly Western military architecture in the region is going to be a little bit tough. Yeah. And so whether that actually comes to fruition or not, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, Gonul, the Turkey deal on the S-400 seems to be stalled right now. Is that correct?
Yes, Turkish foreign minister recently said that Turkey could back out of the deal if Russia does not share technology with Turkey.
So announcing an S-400 deal is not the same as getting an S-400
is not the
deal.
Same as
Let's go to the last sort of round on sort of the bigger picture of what this means sort of for the Middle East, what it means for the U.S. in the Middle East. And maybe, Robert, you've been, as all of us watching the Middle East, working in the Middle East for a long time. Do you see this as sort of a new era? And in particular, what could be positive about it and what could be dangerous about it?
I think the Trump administration is in general following the Obama policy of retrenchment and at the same time trying to solidify a bit alliances that had been fraying with countries such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt. What really will be important to stability in the region in the coming months and the next year or two will be whether or not the Saudis and the Iranians can figure out a way to begin negotiating in areas where they have real friction, Yemen being at the top. And then the second issue will be states that are failing or on the verge of failing, whether that be Syria, Yemen, Libya. Will they be able to find some new political arrangement that restores stability? Neither Russia nor the United States are the key players in those, although they will have influence on the margins.
Can I just add on to what Robert is saying? Because I think that even though Russia's ability to be involved is going to be limited, and certainly they're not going to replace the United States as the preferred partner for the GCC, but this issue of Iran is potentially an area where the Russians can play a role. As Robert correctly said, there is some interest, certainly on the Iranian side, maybe on the Saudi side, to see whether if there are areas for improvement. But if the Russians were to be involved in trying to push Iran, for example, to be more helpful on the Yemen issue, that would be an area where the Russians could potentially bring something to the table that the United States can. Also, we've seen that Lavrov has already offered, although not accepted, to try to help mediate the dispute with Qatar. So this is, there is some potential for the Russians to actually expand their diplomatic engagement in ways that would help stabilize and reduce tension in the region.
Gonul, what's your view of the bigger picture?
Well, I think with Turkey-Russia rapprochement, I think Turkey has to work with Russia. I mean, Turkey is dependent on Russia for its energy needs, and now it really sees that Russia has become the only partner for Turkey in Syria. But on the other hand, I think the more Turkey and Russia rapprochement deepens, I think the more tension we'll see in Turkey's relations with the West, and I think that's dangerous. Because even now at the Pentagon, and that's been an institution that's been hold very favorable views of Turkey and promoted closer ties with Turkey. Now Turkey has become, there are more and more people at the Pentagon who are very critical of Turkey, Erdogan's new Turkey. So I think that's, working with Russia is okay. I think it serves Turkey's interests on some level, but on the other hand, I think it's straining the relations further with the West.
Interesting. Yeah, and also sort of from a historical perspective, when the Cold War ended and sort of Russia disappeared or the Soviet Union disappeared from the Middle East, one might have expected a period of stability, prosperity, and so on. As it happens, we had the first Gulf War, and then we had 9/11, we had the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. It's been a very, very turbulent time. So it's not like the absence of Russia was a very sort of stable and calm period. And certainly there's risk perhaps of escalation between the two global powers, but maybe also, as some of you have indicated, they do bring also political and diplomatic leverage. And maybe at a time when the U.S., in terms of diplomacy is either absent or dysfunctional or being sort of hollowed out, perhaps there could be a silver lining there. I want to thank you all for joining us at this podcast today. It's been a great discussion. I thank you, our listeners, for tuning in to this podcast. And if you'd like to join the conversation and leave comments about today's podcast, you can visit our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/Middle East Institute. Robert, Jerry, Gonul, thank you for being here. And to our listeners, we'll see you next time.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.